Throughout time and across cultures, artists have used imagination to create things that weren't in the world before, like in Shel Silverstein's book, Don't Bump the Glum. Today, we're going to be making our own glums. And for this, we'll need a few supplies. Brushes. Make sure they are soft enough to use with watercolors, or the paint won't lay like it's supposed to. We'll also need a variety of brushes to create lots of differences in the creatures. A good brush to start with is the wash brush, to get thick, full areas of color in one easy sweep. Another handy brush to have is a liner. This brush, with very long bristles, makes very thin lines, which can be useful for fine details. A round brush is a good handy tool because it can make large pockets of color while also being able to paint fine detail, a kind of Renaissance brush. The last brush, which may be useful to have around, would be a fan brush. This can also help spread wide areas of color while also adding texture in the process. Now let's talk color. It's good to choose colors which can be easily mixed with others and not make any muddy tones. Good go-tos are a middle blue, a middle yellow, and a middle red. This way, colors can be built and mixed more easily. Later in our process, we'll need some fine-tip pens. These can be any brand: Prisma, Sharpie, Micron, Faber-Castell, and so on. But make sure to choose the marker which writes best on the paper provided. Fine tips are easiest to work with on this small scale to add as much detail to the creatures as possible. It's good to have a range of sizes within the fine tips to convey shadows and distance through thickness of line. We'll need a cup of water to activate our watercolors, and some paper towels to help clean the brushes in between uses. Lastly, the paper. A range in sizes is good for this project to help make our minds work beyond and push past the concept of normal. Let's lay some newspaper down to make sure the tables stay clean and watercolor free. Set up your station however it works for you. You'll want your water and paint to be in close proximity to allow for faster application. The quicker and more freely the blobs are painted, the better the results. You'll want to get a palette, some kind of tray, or paper plate to put the tubed watercolors on. Why use watercolors from a tube? Because the colors are often much more saturated and closer to the natural pigment the paint is made with. Now add water to the pigment, and color should start pooling in the tray. The next step is to finally paint. This should be very expressionistic, an exercise for making something that wasn't previously conceived in any way. Simply put the paint to the paper and see what happens. Pool some water and see what shapes can be created through random mark making. In this one I started with the round brush to get a good base, but went back in with the liner to create wispy forms on the outside of the blob. Here I started with the flat brush. Much more surface area can be covered at one time, so I have to be careful not to apply too much watercolor and still leave white space on the page. to form a world for the creature to live in. Lastly, I wanted to test out my fan brush. First, I start with the round brush again to get a good base to work from. From there, I used the fan brush to drag out some of the color to create spiky, free-flowing lines for a border as opposed to a hard, smooth outline. Once finished, lay out all of your dried creations and take in the colors made, patterns or textures formed, and shapes created that might look like they can be transformed. Pick a favorite and begin. Turn your blob upside down and around to observe the different all-over shapes you see. Use a clear plastic film, tracing paper, or another transparent medium to draw over top of your blob to brainstorm different creatures. In the end, pick the one that could be developed the furthest using shading and line with the fine tip pens. Once the final idea and blob is chosen, think about all of the different kinds of line and shading that could make the image seem complete. There are no limits to the types of line or shapes that can be drawn to fill in your creature. Use at least 2 types to create variety, and better distinguish between shapes, body parts, clothing, or environment. Some of these techniques include cross-hatching, evenly thick lines, swirls, stippling or dots, and textures such as scales, feathers, or fur. Don't forget about making some lines thicker or thinner to create illusions. Thicker lines will appear closer in space, and thinner lines will appear further away. And finally, once the creature is drawn, the creation of something imaginary has been completed. You have now brought something silly into the world which wasn't there before. With the remaining creatures or blobs, don't be afraid to make something strange. The more strange, the better. And if a stray mark seems to be made, it can always be worked around. After all, the creatures are made up and have never been made before, so how could it be a mistake?